Welcome to the program. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and it is my pleasure to say that today this program is being co-sponsored with the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences Anti-Black Racism Initiative, with the Sociology Department's Critical Race Initiative, and with the Department of African American Studies at the University of Maryland. So many thanks to our co-sponsors. I would also like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. She is responsible for organizing today's events, doing many things in the background, and I'm grateful to her work. It's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Anna Agathangelou. Before I introduce her to you, I would like to go over some technical matters. So upon joining this virtual meeting, you are muted and your video is off. This program is being recorded. By participating in this virtual meeting, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions at the end of the lecture by going down to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do that at the end of the lecture. So now to say a little bit about today's program. The Baha'i Chair for World Peace is committed to that age-old practice that all societies, and indeed all people, must engage in: the work of both diagnosing the sickness and prescribing the cure. This dual track of analysis and care, evaluation and tenderness is everywhere fraught with challenges. Yet if our universities are to remain relevant, we must continue to make these activities part of the work of building better societies and a more peaceful world. Today's important topic is also a hopeful reminder that the business and call of scholars is to ever imagine new possibilities, new arrangements of how we might live together. Indeed, by identifying the moral chasms which center much of today's societies, scholars like Professor Agathangelou are then able to point to the moral opportunities that will lead to better outcomes. Certainly in our age, we can all agree on the need for new formulations, new practices, and new ideas. Our speaker today, Dr. Agathangelou, is professor at York University in the Department of Politics. In 2014 and 2015, she was a fellow in a program of Science, Technology, and Society at the School of Government at Harvard University, where she developed her project called Found in Translation: Cosmopolitics, the Value of Biotech, and Racial Capitalism. Her most recent work includes special issue in Globalization with Kyle Killian, entitled It's About Time: Climate Change, Global Capital, and Radical Existence. She is the co-editor with Kyle Killian of Time, Temporality, and Violence in International Relations, Defatalizing the Present, Forging Radical Alternatives. She is co-author with L.H.M. Ling, entitled Transforming World Politics from Empire to Multiple Worlds, and author of The Global Political Economy of Sex, Desire, Violence, and Insecurity in Mediterranean Nation States. The title of her talk today is Decolonial and Radical Planetary Futures: Defatalizing Colonial Literacy and Imagination. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Anna Agathangelou.
Thank you so much, Professor Huda Mahmoudi, and also Kate Seaman for inviting me, and also for all the departments and their contributions towards this event. And thanks to all of you, the audience, although I cannot see you, for attending the talk. So today I'm going to divide my talk into 4 different parts. The one I'm just going to give us a little bit of conversation. Some key events of our times. The second part is going to be on the question of imaginaries and literacies. The third part will be on questions of tools and approaches, and what I call, matter and energies. And then the fourth part is going to be practices and literacies, as decolonial and radical planetary acts. So a few of the key events that we're faced today, of course, is Russia's adventures in Ukraine, ongoing war to secure in place a form of global power. COVID-19 has brought to the fore once more that violence, direct and structural, disproportionately affects Black, indigenous, and other marginalized peoples. The devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on African Americans cannot be understood without comprehending how global raciality in the form of anti-Blackness continued to shape the contours of their life chances. Connecting, for example, Black people to slavery persists in the white racial imaginary and has set up a racial contract where to be Black is to be inherently the void, expressed in the speeches, for example, of legislators, mainly conservative Democrats, supported the notion, this notion by citing everything from social Darwinism to strict interpretations of juridical regimes, focusing on the Constitution. One of these Senate legislators, and I want to read it because I want to show how these imaginaries are really prevalent. We Blacks and whites are so different that we ought not to combust one political community. This is cited in Foner. The death toll follows the course of disposability chartered by centuries-long racial capitalism that puts Blacks, indigenous, at substantially greater risk of contracting and dying from the coronavirus. But also simultaneously that brought to the fore that there is a deeper global pandemic, which is a global racial capitalism that positions these communities to experience inordinate violence. Other events that we are faced today, of course, is like, and we have seen that through the displacements, especially right now with Ukraine, but also the conversations around that, but also a lot of the capsizing of boats in the Mediterranean in 2017 of African migrants trying to cross the border from Africa, through the Middle East to Europe. Another big event that we are faced with is environmental degradation and destruction of the earth, ranging from soil erosion, climate change, contamination of life sources, fossil fuels. Simultaneously, as these events have been dominating our lives and organizing and reordering our lives, we have seen a proliferation of discourses, deliberations, and policy documents that speak about crises and disasters, indeed reminding us of the catastrophe that is imminent. Ranging from neoliberals to the most conservative thinkers, we seem to be reaching consensus that the world is reaching its end. Many are rushing to design new Leviathan contracts that expand coloniality and imperial projects to other planets. And of course, you know who the leader of this project is. This planetary moment coincides with the revival of fascisms everywhere, ranging from Europe to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. I mean, for instance, one of the dominant discourse around that was, Donald Trump arguing that, Blacks and immigrants do not, by birth, belong to the citizenship social contract of the United States. I cannot help but wonder how all of these moments are linked to global raciality, the ongoing extraction through colonial and enslaving juridic mechanisms, as well as a series of racialized tools based on hierarchized notions of difference, which allow for the continued extraction of the energy and life of African peoples, and also indigenous life and lands. As Denise da Silva says, we see all this energy existing in the form of global capital. So the second part I want to move us to is like, how is it that all these moments, if you will, are being explained by different dominant imaginaries and literacies? Some dominant ways of attempting to explain these moments in international relations or world politics draw on tools such as universal and retrospective reason, how capital itself operates by retrospectively positing its own production as a starting point, and I will explain a little bit more about that. The formation of specific difference by its continual reproduction of acts of colonization and enslavement shows us, however, that every situation where is specificity or the production of specificity stands in an apparent contradiction to capital's global spread, which is in fact an outcome of social conditions and not an inevitable result of an ancient grounding force of particularity, as Walker tells us. So in a sense, capital on the one hand promises us that, universal freedom basically, and depends on this kind of universalization, but simultaneously does its own work is by grounding, by generating particularities in the form of racism, sexisms, classisms, etc. Most of these tools in these imaginaries cannot yield anything else but more violence. Such violence and the void, and I put the void in quotes here because there is this assumption that there is a void within this order of global racial capitalism, in the form of Blackness, for instance, points to the life otherwise and beyond the temporal notions of the universality, linear temporality, and particularism in the form of retrospection. This reason, of course, belongs only to the subject himself or herself, and not all of those who are presumed devoid. So here, in a sense, there is this dominant presumption, but also orientation that there is only one particular subject that can really will, global capitalism's, possibility and continue its orientation. These forms of violence are fatal. They are orientation within the global sovereign project deadly, orienting both the subject and communities to death, even though there is always this promise of freedom. We see reason, this fatalism, what I call this fatalism, being assembled in the form of critical environmentalisms, reproductive fascisms, and innovative technoscientific capitalisms in the form of geoengineering financial regimes. Crucial to this conversation are the dominant ways that time, coloniality, and value are sutured together to co-constitute fatal notions, imaginations, and projects about species and the planetary. This suturing has a much longer trajectory, and of course, this is very much based on this idea of who has will and determinacy and who does not. But for the sake of this presentation, I will provide us with few hints. Determinacy as a form of will that decides or authorizes the efficient causes or makes possible basically efficiently change in the things of nature. So in a sense, here reason becomes, a way of presupposing a certain kind of will that is able to allow for a certain kind of change and acting basically on nature. Here, of course, what is never been unpacked in some of these dominant frameworks, and we can start here from Darwinism, Bacon, more recently Hegel, Marx. There is this assumption that this will's orientation is ultimately mastery, authority, sovereignty, which rules modern economic, juridical, ethical acts and science. Who claims here, and I'm going to cite Hegel, this presupposition or assumption center in this conversation of judgment and determinacy. Negroes are enslaved by Europeans and sold to America. But as this may be, their lot in their own lands is even more worse, since there is their slavery quite as absolute exists. For it is the essential principle of slavery that man has not yet attained consciousness of his freedom, and consequently sinks down to a mere thing, an object of no value. So this presupposition of slavery as something over there, basically as absolute, as outside the modern project, but also, what this really presumes is that, with the movement into the modern world, slavery is eradicated or remains over there. But here, what is really crucial is that there is a presupposition that Blacks or the slave or, is this thing, this object of no value. And this presupposition informs and shapes a lot of the imaginaries of today, but also how we understand violence today, or not understand it, basically. Of course, here the world and read the world of global racial capital becomes possible due to determinations or decisions made by the mind. All activities of the mind are reduced, as Da Silva tells us, to determinacy, the assignation of value that refers to a universal grid, and the object of knowledge here becomes an effect of judgment. So here, in a sense, everything of the mind, or even its own complex and nuanced intelligence, is being reduced to determinacy. Basically, a will, basically an act that really will move and change nature. Before I proceed to provide us with a couple of examples about these fatal imaginaries, frameworks, and orientations, I will take a detour by one key philosopher who is right now engaging very much with the notion of fatalism. And his name is Frank Ruda, and he's arguing that we need to start thinking from comic fatalism as rationalist fatalism of the future as time of liberation and freedom is structurally modern, and I'm citing him here, whereas pessimism is avowedly structurally Greek. Here, the conversation is so much more complicated. I'm not going to go through his whole argument, but the point I want to make here is that now there is a rush to go back to this notion of fatalism as a starting point of thinking this immanence of catastrophe in the world today. So here, Rada, in a sense, tries to say that the problem that the former meaning basically, the rationalist fatalism addresses is, I just lost my my place here. Not one that the problem that the former addresses is a decidedly modern problem, not one that co-emerged with the origin of Western history, but with the dominant form of organizing our society through the signifier of freedom. It was this problem that in different forms was pointedly identified by rationalist thinkers from Descartes onwards to Marx. It is a modern problem because it is intimately linked to the specifically modern form of organizing society, basically capitalism. Again, I'm continuing to cite Ruda here. If the problem is modern, one should reject the fantasy of solving it by returning to some lost and obfuscated origin. If there can be a preparation for solving it, it must also be rigidly modern. So then in his book, Abolishing Freedom, he argues that fatalism, as construable from the history of modern rationalism, in its very constitution and proceedings comic, and basically that's his own position, comic fatalism, by forcing the transcendental structure of tragedy beyond itself into a collapse, by leaving behind even the givenness of the human condition of history or of tragedy itself for that matter. Comedy emerges precisely at the point where tragedy is pushed beyond its own limits. So here I'm citing Ruda because I think this new kind of imaginary or approach to understanding fatalism of where politics now is becoming really is either optimistic or pessimistic, or in his case is either tragic or comedic, thereby again, in a sense, reinserting this dichotomization of reason and unreason, or determinacy and indeterminacy, but indeterminacy is always quoted as being void, and void is marked basically always by the category of blackness. And I will continue here. Environmentalism, in the environmental debates, we see a similar thing here, but in around these logics about in terms of, what is the future going to be? Is the future going to be of the human, or the human is going to be deracinated? Thereby again reintroducing this dichotomization of the world of the determination as being, an orientation of time in a universal sense, or an orientation of time in a retrospective sense, as I was saying before, around capitalism, or basically, the end of the world where, we don't know the end, but still we try to write the end. Okay, so I am going to move now to another key point around reproductive fascisms. And here, this we have seen very centrally, as I said already, with Donald Trump, but also in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, very much. But what is key there is I want to bring this question of reproduction as central to this conversation, as being, what is being reproduced. And here I will introduce here Ruda again, who has said that the university plays a key role, and that the university basically resolved to be the side, that the contestation between Protestantism and Catholicism got resolved through the Jesuits, by the Jesuits becoming the key optimist of producing knowledge about the world. So that conflict between Protestants and Catholics gets resolved by dividing basically different sides of knowledge production. So in a sense, the university becomes a key side of reproduction technologies or production technologies. And basically here, what I want to highlight is that we need to not only just unpack what takes place in the way we produce ideas about the world, but also the university as a site, as Professor Mahmoudi was saying before, how do we really claim the university as a site of production of the fatal, and I will problematize the fatal not as being dichotomization between fatal and fatalism here. So here I wanted to highlight that, in a sense, this notion of reproductive fascisms is not a newer phenomenon. For example, if we go back and look at some conversations, especially with I.W. Wells, who really brings from the beginning that there is the violence has been fatal, but it has been fatal against Black peoples, because there were always this assumption that they don't have determination, they don't have will, and thereby they can never really even register in the juridical or in the sovereign regimes of the state and even the market. And of course, there what is important is, and I will read here, capitalism does not create life, but always posits that it does simply as a self-evident and available living labor capacity in its most contemporary sense. So even in its use of Black labor and Black life, capitalism never registers that at all, as I already said. So Ida B. Wells challenges these narratives, these orientations, because she brings us back and reorients us to very basic categories, not only to what makes, what the subject is or what the nature of the subject is, but rather what are the constitutive elements of the subject. So questions about matter, questions about energy, questions basically that the Greeks and I think Fanon in a very central way by speaking about breath and also Black Lives Matter raised for us at the center of this conversation. So I'm going to read here, Ida B. Wells stretches Marx's logics to focus beyond primitive accumulation to expose how the necessity of time works through the category of Blackness, transubstantiating it in the hands of formal juridical regimes into a moral defect, into a mere thing, an object of no value, upon whose flesh violence can happen with impunity. So in a sense, Wells from the beginning reorients us to the idea that the criminalization, but also this idea of like moral defect is written into the juridical regimes, into the sovereign project, into capital itself. Thereby, any solutions or any orientations, rather, as I want to say, that can come from there cannot lead us anywhere else than violence, than the fatal violence. Wells is a pioneer in grappling with the ways modernity plays in the configuration of the imperial nation of the US depended extensively on lynching, both for its accumulation processes and the conquest of life energies of Blacks to determine its imperial and national existence simultaneously. An anti-lynching crusader, Wells said lynching was not a form of spontaneous public outrage, but a calculated strategy of racial violence. And I read here from her work, our country's national crime is lynching. It is not the creature of an hour, the sudden outburst of uncontrolled fury, or the unspeakable brutality of an insane mob. It represents the cool, calculated deliberation of intelligent people. Here read reasonable people, who openly avow that there is an unwritten law that justifies them in putting human beings to death without complaint under oath, without trial by jury, without opportunity to make defense, and without right to appeal. So in a sense here, Wells highlights very much how this inscribed violence cannot really allow for any kind of form of justice or reparative orientations, especially when the modern system is really founded on lynching. Similarly, Frederick Douglass does a similar thing. I don't have a lot of time to go into that analysis, but I think what both of them suggest is that the notions of citizenship in the US are inextricably bound to whiteness and property. And of course, this is not just a US phenomenon. I mean, from the beginning, the global raciality is bound with this notion of whiteness as time, and this notion of the other as a void, specifically the slave, Blacks, as time and property. While some indigenous notions stood as a potential and abstracted life to be integrated into the nation state through the secular ideologies of the Jesuits, the enslaved as a thing were never granted this opportunity within the fundamental descriptors of the world, that of space and time. The enslaved stood as the flesh, to remember Horter Spiller's here, the corpus zero sum, the slave. In Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, Spiller speaks of how slavery doesn't only depend on murder and violence, it symbolically, economically, and juridically reduces the Black being to a corpus defined as flesh, as value resembling a commodity, basically as nothing here, and forever branded with an insecurity suggesting Blackness emerges in the world as a void and without inheritance, with dire implications for Black life and history. And I cite Marriott here. Spiller points to the enslaved's capacity, the figure of the slave to history, beyond the grammar of race, with this quoted reference to externally imposed meanings and uses, by revising slavery's grammar, which has no symbolic integrity. And of course, here Spiller adds, the captive body reduces to a thing, becoming being for the captor, and as a category of otherness, the captive body translates it to a potential for pornotrobbing, and a body's sheer physical powerlessness that slides into a more general powerlessness, resonating through various centers of human and social meaning. And again, the figure of the slave here, or the captive, the materiality of the slave, has no role or even the possibility of what Spiller calls elsewhere in this passage, the motive will, to be produced as a specific difference in the grammar of the human or the subject, an equivalence which then encounters the citizen determining sovereign authority. Rather, for her, this figure orients us to horizons otherwise and beyond the political project of enslavement and conquest. So here, in a sense, going back to what I was saying, imaginations and literacies, our tendency is to really draw on imaginations and literacies. These are the dominant ones, and these are the less dominant ones. And then we go back to recover them in order to tell the story. Here, I want to suggest that by reading simultaneously with the dominant ones and, you know, this saturing of determination, basically will, value, time, and coloniality, what we are missing is that there is these ruptures, what Fanon calls these failures, happening simultaneously and orienting us into what Marriott, Da Silva, and many others have pointed into the excess, the void, and the work that the void does on a daily basis to really challenge and disrupt these imaginaries. So in a sense, for us, we cannot just simply say, this is the critique, you know, of these imaginaries, and let's reinsert this, but rather really see how this worked simultaneously. So this brings me to the next point, which is about this notion of what Spivak calls transnational literacy, and she conjuncts it with subaltern literacy. And of course, for her, in doing that, she is trying to challenge the dominant rhetorics produced, bolstering global capitalism, but she also speaks to a theory and practice of transnational literacy emerge as a challenge to those elite forms of university education in the West that prepares students to be what she calls emissaries of transnational capital, or what Althusser calls master of the ruling ideology. In her critique, she articulates that transnational capitalism imposes a new demand upon the interventionist academic and educator working in the North Atlantic Academy, to cultivate the students a method for reading both written text and the world that will enable a persistent critique of their privileged position within capitalist globalization and of the unequal geopolitical and economic relations and processes it has precipitated. Spivak similarly views literacy not simply as a set of technical reading and writing skills, but also the ability to read the world as a text, as a site of social inscription. For Spivak, critical literacy as a decolonizing project must respond to the demands of the present. It thus needs to address the changing nature of colonization and enslavement in a global capitalist system that has altered the territorial organization of economic, social, political activity and state sovereignty, and precipitated new movements of capital and peoples across borders. And she continues, in critique, to argue that the new immigrant intellectuals and students become native informants. Of course, this is a very familiar, for some of us, position about who are the native informants for their home countries. They reproduce the failures what Spivak says of foregoing the loose. They abdicate responsibility for their own position as producers of knowledge about the subaltern at home. At the same time, they produce the subaltern as a self-identical and accessible in its immediacy to the West and global capital itself, and thereby face the heterogeneity and contradictions of the subaltern consciousness. So I will just, for the sake of time here, I will argue that basically, and I use, Gagadri to introduce this notion of what does it really entail to think about literacy in this moment of our times with all these things that I outlined in the beginning, and what does it really mean for us to think about those literacies in excess of the dominant literacies? And here I will say more than just really exposing in a way and making visible these complicities, we need to think about imagination and literacy beyond the extractive and fatalist natures of global raciality and capital. And the ways that they work with each other, especially through the use of time. Transformation of primal flux of energy, of heterogeneity into commensurability, into equivalences here, or into by equivalency or allowing for that, basically towards that orientation, again reinserting the structures where some can be integrated as part of certain sovereign projects and others can never really become commensurable as sovereign, as determining subjects with will. So here I am saying this is not enough to recover past histories, because especially with critiques that we have seen of historicism or rearrange epistemologies of modernity, especially when we know that colonialism and enslavement itself and the production of certain intellectual trajectories have immured both, what we have come to know as colonized life and their own imaginaries and their own creative energies. So in a sense here, what we need to be thinking is to move to my last part, which I want to finish now, is practices and literacies, or what Fanon calls invention. And here for Fanon, and I cite here David Marriott, is a series of leaps or steps characterized by points of departures rather than endings. So in a sense here, Fanon from the beginning challenges this notion of time and space, because for him already that is a particular fatal orientation. And this we can see both in Marxism as well, where Marx talks about the fatal leap, but we have seen that how in a sense Marxism already presumes this orientation, that some people are going to be part of production relations, but some are going to be part of this primitive accumulation. And even in our attempts, and I am one of those people, to register primitive accumulation as part of the conversation of global racial capitalism without ever challenging what is the temporal orientation or what is the presupposition about time in relationship to the nature of the subject of time, we end up participating exactly in this environmental, reproductive, etc. fatalisms. So with invention, Fanon introduces what David Marriott calls a driving link between time and event, which is not predetermined and is not given to be read as the expressive channel of an alienated, repressed will that needs to be freed by somebody, by some kind of a master, in a sense. So here, I will move a little bit to Fanon. Fanon reads the world otherwise. Excuse me, I will set up this before I read this to you. I find myself at the beginning of my critique. Fanon says, raciality, or Fanon raises for us, raciality is a theory of reading and writing. Its global matrix depends on a capture and obliteration that generates such effective regimes as national humiliation, working through speculative capitalisms. However, raciality is also a global field. There is no such thing as substantial failure or the failure to move on. Instead, there are pockets of energy in a vast expanse of gaps. In this theory, global raciality in a sense, and engaging with that, as I already articulated, reading has a more profound role to play in global life than to provide access to normative representations of primal feelings and pure sensations, to remember Kant here. By connecting modes of reading to social relations, it helps the reader to understand how history and how the raciality structure ascribes certain orientations in the form of economies, in the form of the sovereign, in the form of the nation state, in the form of politics itself, including fatal violence, thereby pointing to how pivotal it is to think together of how to transform raciality and global capital. Fanon reads the world otherwise. In Black Skin, White Mask, and The Wretched of the Earth, he articulates affects or politics such as laughter, weeping, trembling, nausea, ejaculation, vomiting, involuntary and emotive, bodily and cerebral. They are not simply metaphors for him. Rather, they hover, to borrow from Raymond Williams, at the very edge of semantic availability as fissures in raciality's dominant representations. Through careful leaps, the structure of violence and generators of such regimes are opened up, or they are opened up in terms of their own failures, activating invention, the Fanonian moment to come, the moment that does not await the white light of reason or the multiple representations of the corporeal, as it is already penetrated by dark potentials that could transform our sense of the self, of institutions and the world. But why do such figures, energies appear in his writing? And here I want to say that I am reading Fanon's notion of invention as a way of reopening us in terms of thinking what kinds of imaginaries, what kinds of reading processes, what kinds of literacies do we need at this particular moment, not only to diagnose, as Professor Mahmoud already said, but also to really rapture some of these dominant institutions that constantly reorient us to fatalism. Fanon opens Black Skin, White Mask with their strange and haunting assertion that the explosion would not happen today. This evasive statement, scripted in a performance of thought and tenuous composure, is immediately confounded by seeming contradicting temporalities. It is too soon or too late, Fanon says. Propelled by the shadow presence and absence of this explosion, Fanon oscillates between these uncanny temporalities of anticipation and belatedness. It resounds with the shattering and fragmentation of the colonized Black subject. Framed by the colonized subject's struggle against the overdetermined narratives of colonial history, the fact of Blackness begins with the sin of failure. Opening with the phrase, "I came into this world," Fanon stages a linear sequential narrative of history, as some have told us, with the deliberate use of serial temporal markers, and then, enunciating the narrative's progressive linear movement. The rhythm is quickly disturbed by a physical and percussive stumble and becomes a bodily representation of paralysis. But as I reach the other side, I stumble, and the movements, the attitudes, the glances of the other fix me there. His long sentences break into a staccato. I was indignant. I demanded an explanation. Nothing happened. I burst apart. Much has been said about how this bursting of the self conveys the violent loss and splintering of the colonized subject, but engaging this sudden eruptive moment of the text through its temporal and affective energies, we find the configuration of time and affect that is the theorizing, I argue, expressing of Fanon's writing. Propelled by his intense anger, the narrator's experience of sudden disintegration hurls the text into the present tense. This explosion rising from within a realm of intense emotion inhabits the temporality of the moment, but also ruptures it. It also reorients us to another moment, another way. The scene ends with the initial swells of anger diffusing into a melancholic recognition that the recuperation of the fractured I is now enacted only through the subjugation of the colonizer's representation. The scene dramatizes the loss of the colonized self, to the history of which the representation I is already prescripted entity, and it only has one orientation, one, a future, overdetermined from without. The Fanonian explosion is not a metaphor. It is an emergent response to a politics that demands just fatal life. It is at the core of Fanon's writing on violence and decolonization, for it is the inevitable release of this tense muscle that Fanon articulates as the possible side of the colonial system's destruction. Thus, the affective energies accumulating in the slave and colonized subject await their inevitable violent and explosive release. So basically, in a sense, Fanon here points that the only way that these notions of determinacy will determine judgments can be really released out of these fatal structures and regimes is basically through these failures, through these inevitable violent and explosive releases. In a sense, Fanon here also does not really have this predetermined notion of revolution, as Marriott already argues in his own work, but really challenges how we understand this notion of revolution, closely tied with the notion of will. So in one case, Fanon describes an African soldier, and I will finish in 1 minute, haunted by his violent actions. In a footnote, he ruminates on what he describes as this man's existential vertigo. As he grapples with the place of violence and militancy in the struggle, questions of colonial viscerality bring him to the question of time. We are forever pursued by our actions. Fanon's thoughts on violence and its explosive affects resurface in questions of basically, again, a corporeal agency, will, and the snares of history. Could the Black and colonized subject ever be pessimistic or optimistic in a history that writes him as non-existent, as void? So I will just leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Agafangelou, for that very thought-provoking talk. We already have some questions, and I'm going to maybe ask Dr. Seaman to start us off.
Absolutely. So the first question, it's in two parts, comes from Malik Wilson. How do we modulate between a morally heterodox, socially heretical, and often intellectually promiscuous indigenous barbershop commentary among African Americans, for instance, of which he is an African American, and an academically driven approach, which can often feel like an outside importation of largely European continental, and even in the case of Fanon, continental critiquing ideals. And then to continue, for instance, many African Americans view their success as tied not to revolutionary ideas found in Marx or Fanon, but to seemingly conservative institutions like the Black Church. Or more broadly, how do you reconcile the reality that it is often newly arrived American immigrants of all backgrounds most in favor of capitalism? Do we vandalize and scandalize the hermeneutic reality of African American achievement when we bring in sweeping outer notions?
Very complex question. Thanks for that question. It has so many parts. I don't think I can do justice to it. But I will just start us with, again, not to really, maybe not really two Russians, to this question of as let's say the hermeneutic, are we scandalizing, you know, these kinds of notions, especially around the work that has been done to become in a way, or to be integrated, or to be commensurate in certain structures. So I don't want to begin there, you know, but rather to really ask the question, what does it really take? You know, what are the costs that it takes to be part of that, you know, structure itself, you know, and whether that kind of orientation leads to the kind of, I mean, in a Fanonian sense, liberation, but even in the Black conservative church, there is still the notion of liberation, whether that needs to a kind of a liberation that is not so tied to a particular kind of a subject who has a particular kind of will that wills the world in only one orientation. So I will just leave it there. So the conversation here is not about, you know, dismissing or scandalizing of the labor, the life of people, you know, to be part of certain structures, but rather to ask the question, at what cost does that happen? And at whose, not just exclusions, but also relegations, ongoing relegations into certain void mechanisms that really allows for ongoing suffering, pain, and violence with impunity.
If I may ask the next question, I wanted to understand better Fanon's concept of rapture, especially of institutions. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I can. So basically, I think Fanon is, first of all, he's problematizing the way we understand, you know, modern thought. How is modern thought in different ways, like, for instance, through reason, and through its multiple structures of reason, meaning regimes of reason. And here we can, I mean, I gave a few ideas, like, for instance, Darwinism, you know, evolution, or Bacon around the question of science, or even, you know, Descartes trying to resolve basically the scholastic queries around nature, and, you know, like basically what is considered Greek in modern thought. So in a sense, Fanon is grappling with that, but not on the register only of these racial categorizations and epistemes, but also what are the ways that we articulate notions of nature, and basically, you know, who is a human, who is a species, you know, what is nature, you know, these kinds of queries. So for him, he wants us to zoom in into that and understand how these are really linked, you know, and it's not because they're becoming invisible, because the Black thought has highlighted that these are not invisible. From the beginning, lynch law is basically central to the conversation of ordering that. So he wants to look at moments where the sovereign, you know, or capital itself, you know, what I call staccato, fail. You know, they promise one thing, but they fail. They fail in quotes here, in the sense that from the beginning, they write certain projects outside them, or they attempt to write outside them, all the while innovating itself for its own movement by really grappling in those energies. So Fanon wants us to really not really rush to the sovereign project as the solution to the problem, or the market, or let's say to certain regimes, because he's saying from the beginning how we arrange time and space is already problematic, and how we arrange politics and ethics is already problematic, because the assumptions and presuppositions that hold this together are already excluding, you know, a Black. And then of course he uses the notion of the colonized very much in his own work. Yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Thank you very much. Okay, do you have a question?
I do. I think it actually follows on a little bit from what you were just talking about. One of the things I was interested in is this idea of the overdetermined narratives of kind of history, and particularly colonial history. So this happening in a kind of a linear sequence, and what happens when we look at it in a different way and we don't look at it in this kind of linear fashion, and how does that change how we approach history? And then also, how does that change, I guess, following on from that, how does that change, being that we are all in education, how does that change how we should teach moments in history or moments in time?
Great question again. So that's what I was trying to do with this notion of, or I'm trying to, because I'm just developing it through this lecture, actually, imaginaries, imagination, literacy. So one of the key points that I see as an educator myself is that the forefront of literacy, there is a presupposition of extraction, and in a sense that overdetermines not only narratives, but overdetermines how we organize and order our life and how we educate ourselves. So in a sense, here there is a kind of a hierarchization of knowledge, that some knowledge counts or some knowledge is important. You need to really capture it, and extract it. Whereas other knowledge is rendered what Fanon says, avoid. So in a sense there, and void here, I don't mean it only in terms of like there is this consolidated subject, void, I mean it here in terms of like the different elements that make life possible. Air, water, what else, like fire, so the basic elements in a sense. So here, going back to the query, how do we teach? So here I was trying to do a little bit of this, but I need to do more of that, more centrally. I think, with Ida B. Wells, going back to Ida B. Wells, I can take her as a central author of world politics, but many times we don't see Ida B. Wells as being a central author of politics, because in a sense, not only she is exposing that the sovereign structure, the modern structure is extractive, but it depends on lynching as part and parcel of its making. So when we are teaching, not only we relegate these kinds of authors to, we let's say, area studies, especially in our discipline, my discipline, politics, but we also say this person cannot be read and conjuncted next to like somebody that we always read, Hobbes, Locke, who else can I tell you, Karl Marx. But let's read Karl Marx and Ida B. Wells next to each other and really see what the conversation is really about, and for me, I think that's what I mean, like this overdetermined is already overdetermined because the orientation of the university already presupposes extraction literacy, and I think this is really key because not only it disenables us from really diagnosis, as Fanon will say, the problem, but it really disenabling us from asking questions, central questions about life and existence, so, and our basically role in that, so I think here is just, I will go back to Fanon here, the failure of the university we have seen very much now, because now we're really talking about how we want to bring in the market and do all these collaborations, with the market in order to be able to do research, in order to be able to, brand our knowledge, So these are all over determinations that come with like global capitalism as conjuncted with global raciality. What kind of subject has will and determination and judgment to decide the organizing and ordering of the world itself, of nature, of earth, of people. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. can you comment a little bit about where does the feminist lens fit into all this?
Yes. Okay, I had it, in the writing, but I didn't really have a lot of time to unpack it, so I decided to leave it. So basically, when I was talking about reproduction, and what with Spillers, but also with Ida B. Wells, but I will read, one thing that comes out of Deleuze and Guattari cited in Walker. Mommy and daddy also indicate the tropology of land, mommy, and capital, daddy, who cannot pretend that history didn't precede their particular demented conspiracy of, on the one hand, patriarchy and the nation state, the reproduction of labor power, and on the other hand, the forcible coercion or violence of money and commodities, the smooth circulation world superimposed on our world. What do I mean here? So there is this notion of mommy and daddy in our imaginaries, mommy being basically the earth, nature, and then daddy being capital. So capital becomes the determining will on this nature, okay? And of course, Deleuze and Guattari do it in a metaphorical sense, but I want to challenge that. That's not a metaphor. And that consolidation of mommy and daddy already is part of that orientation that I was saying before of time and space arrangement. But within that, we have all these racial regimes that come in the form of family, in the form of household, in the form of, care. Now is the new cutting edge word, like we're going to care. And I'm not against care, okay? But what I want to bring here is that if social reproduction has a particular orientation, then what that really does for us in terms of patriarchy, in terms of feminist politics, we have to ask as feminists, what is the orientation of patriarchy? And many feminists themselves are colluding with some of these newer reproductive mechanisms because they always remain on the level of the racial regimes. They don't ask what are the I don't want to say underlying, what are the material ways that we organize extraction or colonization. For instance, if we're going to think about nature, one of the central questions here about fossil fuels has created so many different demands, and some scholars do brilliant work showing issues like in the household, for instance, electricity, cars, how in a sense this was dependent on organizing and ordering life in these nuclear families, thereby disenabling anybody who didn't have that notion of family. And again, family is a much more complicated notion. But here I want to just say that when we think about reproduction, what are the basic assumptions that we make about reproduction? And for instance, one of the things that Audre Lorde says about reproduction is that we constantly assume that there needs to be an inheritance in the way we reproduce both the subject or the worker, and in that sense, that orientation, again, creates and allows for this presumption that some people can never inherit, can never be even part of families, can never really be even good patriarchal mommies and daddies. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there other questions? Please pose them now. So how do we imagine a different world?
Okay. So basically, this is going back to the question that I do with Fanon. Fanon really uses this notion of invention. And Fanon, in a sense, invention depends on this notion of making a leap, what he calls a real leap, and not a fatal living in the Marxist sense, you know? So here raises a lot of questions about how we understand truth and falsehoods, how we understand reality, you know, and unreality, determinancy and indeterminacy. But it also poses questions about, you know, this notion of time as like a past, present, and future. But what I was also critiquing in my newer work, that capitalism does not only depend on a universal notion of time, thereby when we think about the colonial imaginaries, we want to say, oh, you know, in the past, this is what we did, or this is how we struggled. But as I said previously, is to look at the ruptures that and the failures, you know, in these conversations that are really key there, and in a sense, what possibilities are there. And it doesn't really mean the colonial, this is the end, this is, we know the end, because even the end that we may create may not be really the colonial that we are all assuming we know, you know? So in this sense, I think Fanon really challenges this dichotomizing thinking. Is colonial or is decolonial? Is you know, revolutionary or is not? You know, it's determining or is not? You know, Fanon in a sense says that if really we begin with that, we are missing that void, that interregnum, what Lily and I call in our work the interregnum, which is the heterogeneous energies, you know, that are really a key in the way that they can be reorganized order. But that's not us giving the answer. That's a practical project that has to be done in a collective sense. So yeah, so in a sense, even imagination itself has to be done collectively, especially when our own literacies, they are not just only European based or Western based, but it's also even knowledges that we are being brought in right now from other parts of the world, they are made to become commensurate in a certain way, and thereby missing some of the radicalness that comes with some of those knowledges. So for instance, you know, if we go back to, you know, your own work, Professor Mahmoudi, I mean, some of the key conversations that were happening around spirituality, around, you know, the secular, you know, there were very nuanced, you know, conversations. But in the process of really making them commensurate, we miss some of those nuances and some of the failures of those nuances that are really important in the way they are being mobilized, you know, in terms of this extractive development, you know. So I think, yeah, so this is just an orientation in a sense.
No, that's very helpful. And really, you're challenging us in very good ways, actually, I think. Yeah. Kate, did you have another question? Or
I do, yeah. So I wanted to build on that a little bit and think about the impact of the pandemic over the past couple of years and how that has either opened up possibilities or possibly closed down possibilities, and ways that it has exposed some of the inequalities that we knew were there, but has really kind of opened that up to a broader audience in many ways, and how that has opened up new conversations, and then also thinking of that in terms of a possible rupture in the way that you're talking about it. Is that something that could lead to changes?
So, I mean, this is a kind of a difficult question to answer in the abstract, because in a sense we're always thinking abstractly, you know, around these issues. I mean, abstractly in the sense that I don't want to give a theory, you know, because a theory that says, okay, this is what's going to happen. But I do want to argue that in a sense, COVID-19 exposed very centrally the social contract, the social compact, you know, and it's not that we didn't know this before, but now it has become, I don't want to say popularized, but even acknowledged by even some corners that they have never really acknowledged it. So in that sense, there is this a kind of ongoing kind of vying, in a sense, towards the reorientation of capital, global capital, how to really use this moment to, again, make commensurate and make capital, again, as telling us that it has always been there from the beginning. The foundations of the whole world and existence is capital, and now no other options. So in that sense, I think there is the move, but there is also a lot of heterogeneous energies being redirected in really, in a sense, in pointing to some of those staccatos that Fanon told us about, in both in terms of who the subject is, who has the will, quote unquote here, but also, what other viable, not just visions, but what are some other viable ways of organizing and altering our organizing our existence, our societies, our world. So in a sense, COVID-19 has exposed, that the sovereign, it has not given solutions. The market is not and has not been able to give solutions. But yet still there is, I was giving you the idea of going to Mars, now, because now we're going to expand the extraction to Mars, and that's a way of postponing basically our imaginaries from understanding that a lot of these problems are created and have been sustained because of our own ways of organizing and altering our life. And I don't mean everybody is in the same way, basically by particular people organizing and altering a life in an extractive sense. So I think for me, COVID-19 has exposed that, but also not just COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, bringing very centrally the question of who has space to breathe. And COVID-19 is also about breathing, global capital did not respond immediately, and they tried to use all these rhetorics of who is responsible, China is responsible. Of course, we knew that Chinese capital is directly entangled with US capital, with European capital, and we know, for instance, that a lot of the elites, CEOs, if we want to say it originates in China, were the ones that were moving back and forth in the Wuhan region. But nobody, that doesn't really become part of the conversation or our kind of, challenges and queries, because the moment that becomes part of that, then, we cannot really allow business as usual. And COVID-19 is going to, basically now what is at stake is the vying for those heterogeneous energies for a world otherwise, but not in this catastrophic sense, because in a sense, what I was trying to argue, all the imaginaries that are available to us from the beginning presume the catastrophe, and, what's his name? Oh my God, I forget right now. Agamben, that's a very interesting reading of Hobbes, and in a sense, the catastrophe, the second coming, this is how Agamben reads that, it's already embedded and scripted, so in a sense, what are we talking about when we say catastrophe, or the end? What are we talking about? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. If there are no more questions, I think I'd like to just really take this opportunity to thank you for a very thoughtful presentation. There's much that needs to be digested and thought about, because you are really challenging us in new ways. And I thank you very much, Dr. For making such a beautiful presentation to us about this very difficult problem that the world we are facing right now. We see exactly what's happening before us. And so thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks also to the audience and the great questions. I know I didn't do justice to your queries, but you can email me if you want, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to just announce now for the audience our upcoming events, if you are interested. And here is the first one, which is given by Professor Gunther Jekeli from Germany. He will talk about anti-Semitism in the world and why it's often difficult to address its specificity. That'll be on March 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We hope you join us. And then our last event for our spring semester, or this academic year, is by Dr. Olivia Ruta-Ziba from South Africa, who will speak on dignity, repair, and retreat, reflections on anti-colonial and anti-racist solidarity. That event is on April 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Both events are online. We hope you join us. Please sign up for these events. And thank you for joining us today. Until next time, we'll take care of yourself and we'll see you then.